Hello, my name is Ahmed. I am 9 years old and I am refugee. I come from Syria. As he said this, he pointed to Miss Hempsey, who held up a drawing showing a house and a tree and a car in front of some mountains, and in front of the car were 4 people labelled me, Mum, Dad, and Sister, and a cat. This was the drawing. I was surprised because I never thought about Ahmed having a brother or a sister. I thought he was like me and didn't have any. His sister wasn't at our school. In the picture she looked smaller than him, so maybe she was in nursery. But in Syria, there is big war, said Ahmed, and he pointed to Miss Hempsey again, who held up another picture. This one showed buildings on fire and bombs dropping from a plane and lots of people lying on the ground and other people holding guns. It looked like this. Josie stopped chewing her hair and looked at me and then looked back at the drawing again. And from behind I heard someone whisper, "Whoa, he's seen a real bomb and a real gun." Because of war, my family run away, said Ahmed, and his lion eyes became big, round and watery. We went on mountain and rivers and carry bags and cat. This time Miss Hempsey held up a picture showing a family crossing mountains and rivers, and in the sky birds were crying. In the picture, Ahmed had drawn himself carrying a red rucksack with a black stripe on it, just like the one he had now. That was when I knew why he loved it so much and why he cried when it had been filled with Brendan the Bully's horrible baked beans. He had carried it all the way from his house and over a mountain, which meant it was lots more important and lots more special than any of our bags. This was the picture. Then, nowhere safe, so we get on boat on big sea. This time Miss Hempsey held up a drawing of a boat. But the boat wasn't like a normal boat with sails and pointy ends and wooden sides. This was flat and round and was orange on the sides, just like the ones I had seen on the news that didn't have any toilets on them. And inside the boat were lots of people, all wearing vests that made them look like puffin birds. But there were people in the water too, and they had bubbles coming out of their mouths saying, "Help me." Everyone leaned forward in their chairs and tried to read the labels. Ahmed had put over some of the people's heads. I saw me and Mum and Dad, but there wasn't one for sister or cat. I know cats don't like water because Josie has a cat, and she says it screams whenever it rains and always wants to stay inside. So maybe Ahmed's cat didn't want to get into the boat, and maybe his sister didn't want to leave it behind, so she stayed behind to look after it. This was the boat picture. Then we were in another country called Greece, said Ahmed. We live in tents with lots of people who run away like me. They came from lots of countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan and Eritrea. The next picture showed a flag with blue and white stripes and a white cross in a blue corner, and next to it were lots of tents and people everywhere sitting next to fires and sleeping on the floor. In this picture, only the words me and Dad could be seen. Ahmed's mum must be sleeping inside one of the tents. This was the picture. Then we walk long time in lots of country. It was cold and we sleep on the floor. And then we stay in France. This time Ahmed pointed to the next picture with his finger and showed us the railway tracks he had drawn. On it were people carrying suitcases and children, and all of them were walking to a wall with barbed wire on the top. Everyone looked sad, and in the corner there were army tanks and soldiers holding guns, and all the guns were pointing at the people with the suitcases and children. Miss Hempsey held this drawing up for longer than any of the others because Ahmed was looking at it and didn't seem to want to stop staring at it. This was the drawing. Then I come here and come to school. I like here. No bombs. It's safe. And I like new friends and teacher and play football. Ahmed stood and stared at everyone, and everyone stared back. Mrs. Khan blew her nose loudly, and Miss Hempsey put the drawings down and gave Ahmed a hug. Thank you, Ahmed, said Mrs. Khan, standing up and putting a hand on his shoulder. Everyone, let's give Ahmed a huge round of applause for being so brave and for sharing his story with us. We all clapped, but we didn't clap as loud as we usually do for stories because I think we were feeling strange. I don't think any of us had ever heard a story like it before. And as sad and as scary as it was even sadder and scarier because it wasn't just a made-up story from one of our reading books. It was all real. Ahmed had survived everything his pictures had shown us and was here with us. Knowing that made me feel sorry and proud and scared for him all at once. But most of all, it made me want to tell him he was definitely the bravest person I knew. Now, as you have seen, Ahmed's story is very special, and I'm sure you have lots of questions you want to ask him, said Mrs. Khan. Everyone's hands immediately shot up into the air, but I think mine was first. That's wonderful, smiled Mrs. Khan as she signalled at us to put our hands down. But as Ahmed is still learning his English words, we're only going to ask him 3 questions. I want you all to write down just one question for him on a piece of paper. Mrs. Khan walked around and gave us each a thin slip of blank paper. And when you are done, Miss Hempsey is going to pick out 3 questions we can ask him. You have a few minutes to think of your question and to write it out in your very best handwriting. Try to get all your spellings right and remember, just one question each. The entire class fell quiet as everyone grabbed their pencils, put their heads down and wrote out their questions. I had lots of questions that I wanted to ask, but I picked the one that was the most new and wrote that one out. After a few minutes, Mrs. Khan said our time was up, and Miss Hempsey collected all the bits of paper. Everyone began to whisper to one another as Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hempsey looked through our questions and either shook their heads or nodded. What did you ask? Whispered Tom, turning around. I asked why he didn't stay in Greece because the weather's warmer there and they have more seaside places, whispered back Josie. Oh, I asked how fast he had to run to get away from the bombs, whispered Tom. Michael? What did you ask? Whispered Josie, leaning forward and poking Michael on the shoulder. I asked if it was scary to be in the boat and if he was on it at night time, said Michael. That's 2 questions, whispered Josie, shaking her head. Then she looked at me. What did you ask? I asked what happened to his cat and what his sister's name is, I answered. Oh, said Tom, but that's 2 questions as well. Right, everyone, said Mrs. Khan, clapping her hands so that we all stopped whispering and looked to the front of the class. We have some excellent questions here, but we've chosen 3. I'm going to say them in English, and then Miss Hempsey is going to translate both the question and answer for us. Right. The first question is, what did your mum and dad do in Syria? Miss Hempsey spoke to Ahmed in Kurdish, and he said something back. Miss Hempsey nodded and then, looking at us, said, Ahmed's father was a teacher and his mother wrote for a newspaper. Everyone in class nodded and we waited for Mrs. Khan to read out the next question. I crossed my fingers extra tight in the hope that it would be mine. The next question is, what did you like doing most before the war happened? We waited for Miss Hempsey to tell Ahmed what the question was and then the reply. He liked to play football with his friends, answered Miss Hempsey, and going to the park with his grandfather and eating kibba. She smiled at Ahmed, and before any of us could ask what a kibba was, explained, a kibba is a very special snack which is filled with minced meat in the middle and is covered with lots of delicious spices. It's very famous in Syria, and it looks like... Miss Hempsey went over to the blackboard and quickly drew a shape. It looked like a small American football. Is that the right shape, Ahmed? She asked. Ahmed nodded. We all looked at each other and tried to imagine what an American football with mincemeat in the middle might taste like. As Mrs. Khan held up the last slip of paper, I decided to cross both my toes and fingers, but it didn't work because then she said, "And the last question is, do you still sleep in a tent or do you sleep in a house now?" When Ahmed heard this question from Miss Hempsey, he shook his head and said something. "No, he sleeps in a house now," said Miss Hempsey, "and he is happy because there is a toilet in it and hot water and food." As we all nodded to each other, Mrs. Khan put her arm around Ahmed and said, "Let's give Ahmed another round of applause, shall we?" This time nearly everyone clapped much louder than before, and Michael even cried out, "Woohoo!" as Ahmed and Miss Hempsey went and sat back down. But I could see Brendan the bully mouthing "boo" and making a face as if something smelled, and Liam giving a double thumbs down. I looked back at Mrs. Khan and Miss Hempsey, hoping that they had seen too, but they were busy looking at Ahmed. "Right now, everyone, before we leave today, I want you all to listen to me very carefully." Mrs. Khan clapped her hands once and waited for everyone to settle back down. As I said, you all had some fantastic questions for Ahmed, but I'm very proud of you for thinking up such interesting and thoughtful ones too. But, and here she looked at us with her eyebrows raised, which meant she was being extra serious and would be extra angry if we didn't listen to her, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that running away from a war and leaving your home is a very hard thing to do. And it's especially hard when you have to try and put all the missing pieces of your life back together again in a place that's new and strange to you. Then Mrs. Khan quickly glanced at me and Josie and Michael and Tom and said, "I know that some of you miss Ahmed when he's not allowed to go out and play, and I know you all have lots of questions for him, but it's very important that he talks to people who know what he's been through and who can help him feel better. And it's even more important that they ask him the kinds of questions you all want to ask him in a safe and secluded space first, before he's ready to speak to other people more. Okay?" Josie looked over at me and I looked over at her, and Tom and Michael looked over their shoulders at us. So that was what the seclusion was for. It was so that Ahmed could talk to people. "So," continued Mrs. Khan, "I want you all to promise me that you won't ask Ahmed any more questions about the war or about his family without asking me or Miss Hempsey first. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mrs. Khan," said the class as the bell for home time began to ring. "Good. Now, row one, put away your things and off you go. Make sure you all have everything you need for your homework assignment for the half term, and I'll see you in a week's time." As we waited for our row to be called out, I looked over my shoulder at Ahmed and wondered what pieces he was still missing before he could put his life back together again. It was like a jigsaw, I thought. I hate doing jigsaws, even the easy ones, because I always get bored halfway through, and I couldn't imagine trying to do one that had missing pieces. I sure hoped that when he was running away from all the bullies and the bombs, Ahmed hadn't lost any of the important pieces on the way, and that if he had, someone was helping him fix new ones that were exactly the right shape and colours that he needed.